Hi, in this lecture, we're going to talk more about neurotransmitters and some specific actions of these. Now, when we look at neurotransmitters, we can break them up into different types of categories. We usually start with acetylcholine as its own category because that was the first one discovered. Then we'll talk about what are called biogenic amines, and biogenic amines are called catecholamines. You may have heard this term before. These include norepinephrine, dopamine, and serotonin. We'll talk about the amino acids. The amino acids are amino acids that actually function as a neurotransmitter in the brain in particular. We'll be looking at glutamate and GABA, and then we'll look at the big long chains of amino acids called neuropeptides, and these are endorphins, which are our natural opiates, something called substance P, and neuropeptide Y, and then we'll wrap it all up with the endocannabinoid system. So let's start with acetylcholine, and as we go over the neurotransmitters, we actually talked about this already, and you'll see it as we talk about acetylcholine. Neurotransmitters, remember, can be excitatory or inhibitory. If they're excitatory, they're going to depolarize the next neuron, right? They're going to send in excitatory information to depolarize. So remember, that means that when the neurotransmitter binds, it's going to go ahead and open those sodium channels. Sodium rushes in, and we excite the next neuron. They can also be inhibitory, and if they're inhibitory, remember, they slow things down by hyperpolarizing. And there's two ways that you hyperpolarize. Do you remember how to inhibit or hyperpolarize a neuron? One is to open potassium channels. And when we open potassium channels, potassium always leaves the cell. So you're losing positive charges, so you make it more negative or hyperpolarize. And the second way is to open those chloride channels. Remember, chloride's negative, and there's more chloride on the outside of the cell. So when you open those, chloride rushes in. So that's going to slow things down. Now, I'm going to give you an example with acetylcholine because it does both. And what you're going to see is that it's not the neurotransmitter itself that determines if the result is excitatory or inhibitory, but it's more about the receptor. So the receptor actually determines if it's excitatory or inhibitory. So you have this picture here for acetylcholine, and you already learned the steps for acetylcholine. Just a real quick review, right? Action potential shoots down. We know calcium has to enter. That's what allows those vesicles to fuse and release acetylcholine. It binds to its receptor and it carries out its response, and then it's broken down by acetylcholine esterase and removed from the synapse. But what does acetylcholine do? Well, you already learned in skeletal muscle that it was excitatory, so it's going to open sodium channels, right, and depolarize muscle. Acetylcholine is actually the main neurotransmitter for your parasympathetic nervous system. So when we study that, we'll be seeing it a lot. It's released at all the synapses for the parasympathetic division. Now, the receptors that bind acetylcholine are called cholinergic. So see acetylcholine, choline in the word, cholinergic. And they have two flavors, so to speak. They have nicotinic and muscarinic. Now, the nicotinic receptors are the ones in skeletal muscle that we saw at the neuromuscular junction. And we know that in skeletal muscle that it's excitatory. In fact, we talked about it binding to the receptors and opening the sodium channels to depolarize the muscle. In cardiac muscle, it binds to muscarinic receptors. And in cardiac muscle, it's inhibitory. In cardiac muscle, it actually is going to open up potassium channels. And remember that when we open potassium channels, potassium leaves the cell. So this neurotransmitter is excitatory in skeletal muscle, inhibitory in cardiac because of the receptor that varies it. And so we know that acetylcholine is also found in the CNS. It's found in the peripheral nervous system. We said the neuromuscular junction, and the main one for our parasympathetic division. And that's the one you think of like your status quo. Now we're going to move on and talk about these biogenic amines. They're called catecholamines. And so a catecholamine is a couple special classes. Now catecholamines are mainly formed from two amino acids. They tend to be produced from tyrosine and tryptophan. Now, let me see if I can write this a little neater. Tryptophan is the one you hear about all the time that's high in meat. Turkey has a lot of tryptophan, and there's some interactions that go on when you eat a lot of turkey, like maybe at Thanksgiving. Tryptophan is also a precursor to serotonin, and so we'll be coming back and talking a little bit about that turkey coma that you may have experienced. But we're going to go ahead and we're going to start with norepinephrine first. And when we look at norepinephrine, sometimes we just write NE, so it's one of our catecholamines. It is the main neurotransmitter of your sympathetic nervous system. So ANS is autonomic nervous system. Sympathetic uses norepinephrine. Parasympathetic uses acetylcholine. Now, norepinephrine is going to bind to specific receptors called adrenergic receptors. And these adrenergic receptors are two flavors, so to speak. They're going to be alpha, and we usually use the Greek symbol alpha, or beta. And again, the effects will vary depending on if it's binding to an alpha receptor or a beta receptor. So we're looking at this for the sympathetic nervous system, and this is going to come back later. In our brain, however, it's one of the main neurotransmitters that helps you feel good. It makes you feel happy. It makes you feel more awake and alert, and it helps with learning. And so it's a very important one that's released inside the brain. Now, another thing is it can be released from the adrenal medulla. So your adrenal glands above your kidney, you can call them adrenal or suprarenal, have an inside called the adrenal medulla. And norepinephrine is released from the adrenal medulla. Now, when it's released from the adrenal medulla, we have to call it a hormone because it's released and it goes all through your blood and it binds to any adrenergic receptor that it can get to from your blood. So norepinephrine also helps maintain our blood pressure. In fact, it raises our blood pressure. When your sympathetic or fight or flight kicks in, your heart rate goes up and your blood pressure goes up. So it's associated with those actions as well. So if we look at this hormone though, and we think about, well, what if we had too much or too little? Well, if it's too high, it can cause high blood pressure, because that's what it does. It could make you hyperactive, cause more anxiety, irritability, and insomnia, because remember, it can help you feel like awake and alert and really happy. If it's too low, it's associated with depression, problems with memory. It does help us with learning, lack of energy as well. So because it targets these areas of the brain, we do know if it's too low, we tend to see it lower in depression and also with something called ADHD, attention deficit hyperactive disorder, which is associated with learning difficulties. And also there's a drug called Strattera, it's in your notes, and this is a drug used for ADHD because what it does is it prevents the reuptake of norepinephrine. So if you remember, don't allow it to leave the synapse, it's going to be in there longer and it's going to carry out its effects and keep you more awake and alert. And help you focus with ADHD. With ADHD, they usually have too little of these, so any kind of stimuli is interesting. Squirrel. But what happens is if you can boost these levels to a level that keeps your brain active and your brain focused and energized, it helps you with focusing. Now, dopamine is another catecholamine that we'll look at, and I know you've probably heard of dopamine before. This is our feel-good one. This makes us feel really happy. It's similar to norepinephrine, awake, alert, but this one is the one that is associated with motivation. This is associated with the reward pathway. So when you do something and you get that rush of, wow, I really liked that, it's because you release dopamine. And then what happens is you seek out that behavior so you can keep releasing dopamine. So, this could be from something you ate. This could be from something you did. Maybe you dove out of an airplane with a parachute. Maybe you stole something, right? It's not always healthy behaviors, maybe drug addictions, right? We know that this is all associated with the dopamine. You can get addicted to studying. That's why I say when you study, as soon as you're done, do something fun so you can get that dopamine surge, right? You'd be like, I like that. You're going to say, I like to study. You could get there, trust me. So it's our feel-good, our motivational, really important neurotransmitter. It also does affect our heart. So in this picture, you can see some of the functions of dopamine here. Okay, so we focus a lot within the brain, but it also helps our heartbeat, our contractility, how strong our heart contracts, and it also helps in our frontal cortex. It helps with muscle movement. So it's very important for normal movement of muscles. And in fact, if your dopamine is too low, we see this in Parkinson's disease where you don't have enough dopamine. Now, if we look at dopamine again, every drug hits dopamine because if you're doing a drug, it's usually making you feel happy, right? Or making you feel better. And so when you have the drug, you feel better, you get that dopamine surge. And so that's one of the bases for a lot of the drugs that we look at. And we'll be talking about cocaine in just a second because cocaine specifically targets dopamine. So if our levels of dopamine are too low, we're going to have some different signs and symptoms of that. We don't have to write everything down, but often you won't be motivated to do things. You can be depressed. You can have a lot of fatigue because this helps you feel awake and alert. You might not wake up easily in the morning. Now, we also know that lower dopamine is associated with restless leg syndrome, like when you feel like you have to constantly move your legs. We mentioned the Parkinson's disease if you don't have the dopamine. And there's some indication it can cause cravings because a lot of times when we eat those sugary foods, they also surge dopamine for us. So you might be treating yourself with those. So when we're looking at some of the drugs and we're looking at how they affect dopamine, there's a few in your notes. So you have Wellbutrin, and Wellbutrin or Zydan is used to treat depression. It's used to treat, to help people stop smoking. And so that one as a dopamine reuptake inhibitor. So remember, that won't let dopamine leave the synapse. We also know that cocaine works the same way. So we talked, kind of mentioned cocaine, but cocaine is another reuptake inhibitor. And what happens with cocaine is it blocks it so the dopamine can't leave the synapse, and that's what causes the rush. But remember that dopamine can also affect your heart. So it affects the heart and it can cause really, really strong, powerful muscle contractions. And they say that one dose, I put in your notes, of cocaine could increase your risk of a heart attack 24-fold. So it can really have some heart issues. We know that meth and amphetamines, Adderall, is going to also increase our dopamine levels. So amphetamines, or Adderall is what it is. These are treatments for ADHD, again, help you feel awake and alert by increasing the dopamine. So they don't allow it to leave the synapse. They also affect norepinephrine. So it's going to help you feel happy, help you feel focused. Meth, right, methamphetamine is unregulated, so you don't know exactly what you're getting, and it's usually a more stronger, powerful surge of dopamine as well. Now remember, if you're taking these illegal drugs, whether they target norepinephrine or dopamine, what'll happen over time is your brain's going to make less of that, right? You can get addicted to the drug for the dopamine surge, because if you're having the dopamine in the synapse, your body's like, well, I got it there, I don't need to make it. So, they can become addictive. When you go off them over time, your dopamine levels can kind of even out again. Now, when we look at serotonin, that's our last of these big three. Serotonin, again, really, really important in feeling happy. It regulates your mood, helps you feel happy, your sleep, it helps you sleep. It helps lower appetite, helps you feel full. So it's associated with feeling good and happy. This one is made from that tryptophan that we mentioned. It's high in turkeys. And so tryptophan's an essential amino acid, and we need to make serotonin as well as melatonin. Melatonin is what helps you feel sleepy, by the way. So if you have a lot of turkey and a lot of carbs, what happens is you can get this tryptophan surge and get some more melatonin and serotonin. You might feel real sleepy and tired after that. So that's what we call a turkey coma. Now, when we're looking at serotonin, we know that if it's too low, this is one of the first ones they found, causes depression. It can cause impulsive behavior, OCD. It can even cause aggressiveness. So there's a whole bunch of drugs that were first developed to target serotonin. And so they're called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs. And so this is your Prozac, your Lexapro. And so it does just what it says. They actually go into the synapse and they don't allow it to leave. So therefore, it stays in the synapse longer, and it should help with depression because your serotonin levels go up and you feel better. We also know that ecstasy, MDMA, also raises serotonin levels as well. So that might help with the euphoria experience from that medication, or I shouldn't say medication, that's an illegal drug. So if we kind of look at these three right here, we're looking at the catecholamines. They're all pretty important in awake, alert, motivation, feeling happy. So I threw these pictures in here so you could kind of see, again, my norepinephrine, my serotonin, and my dopamine. And there's definitely overlap and what they do. We do know if we're deficient in serotonin, we're going to see some depression and possibly cravings, just like dopamine, but it can also cause us to OCD symptoms and even impulsivity. In fact, unfortunately, suicide and suicidal thoughts could happen due to a decrease in serotonin levels. Now, in your notes, you also have what are called SNRI, and so that stands for serotonin and norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors. So these are medications that are used to target serotonin and norepinephrine. So they'll help with depression. They might help you feel more awake and alert. Sometimes people go on the serotonin meds and they get very, very sleepy. And then the other way that they use for depression is the tricyclic antidepressants. And so they target all three, the big three that we're looking at. And so these are drugs that are going to try to keep all three. And, you know, if you go on antidepressant medication, it's because you're deficient, right, in a neurotransmitter. So it's okay to take the medication to boost your serotonin levels. If you were diabetic, you wouldn't think twice about taking insulin. Unfortunately, it's kind of like this because we have genetics. We didn't get to pick our parents, and we just might not make enough of these neurotransmitters. Now, when we look at the amino acids, we're going to look at two. We're going to look at glutamate and GABA. So glutamate is the most important excitatory neurotransmitter. It works very strongly in our CNS, in our brain in particular. This is, again, critical for everything, but in particular, we look at this with learning and memory, being awake, being alert. So it's very, very excitatory. Now, it's also associated with stroke damage. So when you have a stroke, what happens is the neurons die. And when they die, they can kind of release what's inside. So they have a lot of glutamate because that's the main way they communicate. And when they release all this glutamate, it can actually be toxic at really, really high levels. So it can actually cause neurons to die. So when you have a stroke or a CVA, CVA is cerebrovascular accident, the neurons release the glutamate, and then that can kill or cause other neurons in the area to die, and that can cause a lot of the damage from that. We also know, because it's associated with memory in particular and learning, that glutamate is being looked at as possibly being affected from Alzheimer's, one of the first ones, because one of the earlier signs of Alzheimer's is a loss of memory. So they're looking at glutamate for that. We know that alcohol decreases glutamate levels because alcohol is inhibitory. We also know that caffeine increases glutamate levels, which is why you might feel better when you feel more awake or alert. And then we also know that MSG, which is a food additive, monosodium glutamate, is a source of glutamate. So some people avoid it because if you have too much glutamate, it's been linked to seizures and migraines. And so you might avoid foods with a lot of MSG in it because of the glutamate levels. Now, the opposite of glutamate is GABA. So glutamate is the main excitatory neurotransmitter. GABA is the inhibitory one. So this one is going to slow things down. It's inhibitory. So it seems to help control movement, motor movement, and also with sound and sight, so vision and hearing. But this is the one that makes you more calm. So it helps keep you calm and controlled. It helps lower anxiety. So if you don't have enough GABA, you probably suffer from maybe panic disorders, or you're very, very anxious with thoughts, or anxiety disorders. So they think it might be involved if it's too low with schizophrenia and anxiety disorders. So Valium is a drug that is going to increase your GABA levels. So are barbiturates and alcohol. So all of these are inhibitory and they increase GABA. Now we know that caffeine also suppresses GABA. So again, that's another reason why caffeine might make you feel more awake and more alert. Now we're going to our neuropeptides, and the main one we look at are the endorphins or the opiates. You've probably heard of these before. They're your natural painkillers of the body. So these are usually called endorphins, or you might see them called enkephalins. You've probably heard of the beta endorphins. And so these are neuropeptides, or big long chains of amino acids, and they're made in the brain. And they're usually made in response to maybe pain or stress, but we also know they can go up with exercise and certain foods. And so what they do, you can see, is they make you feel happy. Everything's wonderful. You feel awesome. Your self-esteem is at an all-time high. They help relieve pain, which is how they're often used to reduce pain. And so we know they work in different areas of the brain. Now, we also know they can work in the brain stem at high levels. They actually are inhibitory on breathing. So like a heroin overdose could actually stop you from breathing. So they do that in the brain stem, basically. But we know that they're released during pleasurable activities. We know that one of the ways they work is they block something called substance P, which we're going to next. But substance P is called substance P because it causes pain. And so what happens is when the endorphins are released, they come from your pituitary gland. You can see the endorphins here. What they do is they bind to these opiate receptors and they block the release of substance P. Well, if you don't release substance P, then you're not going to feel the pain. So they really help decrease pain, which is why a lot of drugs derived from them, like OxyContin, is to release pain, to reduce pain. So we know that they help with euphoria as well. Now, we also know, just like all neurotransmitters, they're genetic, so your levels might be lower than other people. There are some things that help boost your endorphins naturally. So they found dark chocolate actually helps. Doing fun things. So, stress, but also things that make you happy, boost your endorphins. We know that exercise releases endorphins, which is why you might feel better after you exercise. But we know laughter boosts them. So there's some things you can do to try to boost your endorphins. So substance P, I kind of already mentioned. We're not going through all the nitty-gritty here, but it's called substance P because when it's released, it's going to cause the sensation of pain to be felt. Now, pain isn't bad. People who don't feel pain usually don't live past 30. It doesn't feel good, but it stops us, right, from doing stupid things, or it's supposed to. So, you burn your hand, you stop. So it is an important trigger for pain and inflammation. And then neuropeptide Y is here because it tends to work in the brain. It's an example of a neuropeptide. And when it's released, it makes you crave carbs. So it's going to make you hungry and it's going to make you crave carbohydrates. They've actually found that if the levels are too low, it can actually cause depression and anxiety. So maybe that's one reason when we are depressed, you might crave carbohydrate-rich foods as well. Now, the endocannabinoid system. There's a lot on this. We're going to talk a little bit about it. So what happens is there's something called anandamide. Let me fix my pen. So anandamide is a chemical that binds to the receptors, which are called the cannabinoid receptors. And so these receptors are going to bind different drugs, different chemicals. So anandamide is probably one of the first ones found, but we have these cannabinoid receptors in our brain, and when anandamide binds to it, it's going to cause all kinds of happy things that happen when they bind. And we also know that THC, one of the main cannabinoids, you can see the structure is very close to anandamide, and so it binds to the same receptors. So these receptors, as you can see, are spread throughout the entire brain, and they do several things. We know they're associated with feeling happy. They are important in forming memories, thoughts, concentration. They help with sense and time perception. They help with muscle coordination. We also know that they help relieve pain and that they can also stimulate appetite. So they're used for a variety of reasons. When we look at the different cannabinoids, there's different ways that we get these. So some of them are actually made in the body. And so some of them are just made in response to things we eat and in our diet. A lot of them come from plant. So we have our THC and our CBD from our basically cannabis plants. And then they can even be synthetically produced. But we know that when they're made, they're going to bind to the cannabinoid receptor to cause all of those effects. We also know that when we look at the cannabis, we know it's used to treat patients who have cancer. It helps decrease the nausea and helps them eat and helps them feel better. We know it also helps with treating epilepsy. It's been found to reduce seizure activity, so it's a treatment for that as well. And there's several different diseases that we know that it's been helpful in treating. This is just a quick summary on some of the neurotransmitters I went over to kind of give you like a kind of tie it all together to talk about these. And the last one I forgot to put in the outline is just something different. It's called NO, or nitric oxide. So it's actually a gas that's dissolved, and it's usually excitatory in the brain. But I wanted to mention it because it has a lot of different functions in the brain. They say it helps with smell and memory and hearing. But it's also a very important vasodilator. So when it's released, it triggers blood vessels to open up or vasodilate. And it's actually released by red blood cells and blood vessels, and it relaxes smooth muscle in your digestive system, and it vasodilates blood vessels, so it really helps lower blood pressure. They think that maybe it's released from glutamate. So they think that glutamate may trigger its release. And then when you release a lot of NO at really high doses, it can be toxic. So they think perhaps when neurons are damaged, they release glutamate. That releases the nitric oxide. So high levels, it can be toxic. But they also look at this with migraines because with migraines, a lot of times, since this is a vasodilator, some migraines happen when there's vasoconstriction of blood vessels in the brain. So this opens them up. You've heard of the drug Viagra, I'm sure, and so Viagra works by increasing nitric oxide to blood vessels to the penis. So when the blood vessels open up, it allows the male to get the erection. So nitric oxide, really important vasodilator out in our blood vessels, but it's also excitatory in the brain. So this wraps up our overview of the neurotransmitters.